You're not worthy of my son.
How can you say that?
I never knew you were this useless.
Son, she is not worthy of you. Send her away.
Mom, what do I do?
She didn't scream. She didn't make a scene. She didn't cross the room and tap him on the shoulder and watch his face fall apart in public. She just stood there, at the top of the stairs, in a gold gown, in her room, and she let him walk in. That is where we are going tonight. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. But to understand what that moment meant, to truly feel the weight of what it cost her to build the room that man walked into, you have to go back, all the way back, to a kitchen floor in Cincinnati, to a woman with her back against a cabinet and her hands up and her voice breaking, to the night that should have ended her, and didn't. And this story begins the way all the most important stories begin, not with a dramatic moment, not with a grand announcement, but with a woman alone in a quiet room making a decision that nobody around her knew she was making. A decision so private and so carefully guarded that the man who had spent 2 years trying to control every corner of her life had absolutely no idea it was already in motion. She had already decided. She was already leaving. She just needed 12 more days. 12 days to pack one bag. 12 days to save the last of the cash. 12 days to smile across the dinner table at the man who had broken her, and say good morning and pass the coffee, and act like everything was exactly as he expected it to be. 12 days of the most demanding performance of her life. And then, a Tuesday morning, an empty house, a note on the kitchen counter, and a door closing behind her so quietly that the neighbors didn't hear a thing. That is where Claire Mercer's story truly begins. Not in the ballroom, not in the gold gown, and not in the moment Raymond Caldwell's face went white. It begins on a Tuesday morning with a duffel bag and $840 and a woman who had just decided, finally, completely, without any turning back, that she was going to find out who she was when nobody was telling her she was nothing. Stay with me. Because what she found and what she built, and what was waiting for Raymond Caldwell on the other side of those ballroom doors, is going to stay with you long after this video is over. Before we go further into Raymond, I want you to understand something important because it matters for everything that comes after. Claire Mercer, when she met Raymond Caldwell, was not a naive woman. She was not an inexperienced woman. She was not someone who had never encountered difficult people or challenging situations. She was a 25-year-old professional who had been largely self-sufficient since the age of 17, who had put herself through university, who was building a career with intention and clarity. And I say this not to diminish what happened to her, because what happened to her was real and it was serious and it caused real damage. But because one of the most persistent and damaging myths about abusive relationships is that the people in them are somehow uniquely fragile or unusually credulous. They are not. Abuse does not happen to a certain kind of person. It happens to people, smart people, competent people, had people with plans and ambitions and solid judgment in every other area of their lives. And it happens because abusers are not stupid. They are, in many cases, extraordinarily skilled at identifying what a person needs and temporarily, convincingly becoming that thing. Raymond Caldwell was that kind of man. He was 40 years old when Claire met him at an industry mixer in Lexington, older than her by 15 years, which felt at the time not like a warning, but like a credential. But he had the easy, practiced confidence of someone who had spent decades in rooms where his presence was welcome and his opinion was solicited. He was tall, well-dressed, articulate. He asked her questions at that first meeting and then actually listened to the answers, which was not as common an experience as it should have been. He told her about his family's real estate development business in Cincinnati. He told her about his travels. And he laughed at himself in a way that suggested self-awareness. He said at the end of that first conversation that she was the most interesting person he had met at one of these events in years. And Claire, who was perceptive and careful and not easily flattered, found herself thinking on the drive home that he had seemed genuine. That is the word she used later. Genuine. It is the word that matters most in what comes next. Raymond pursued her with the kind of deliberate, sustained attention that feels like devotion when you are inside it, and looks, from the outside, with the benefit of time and distance, like strategy. He called when he said he would call. He remembered details from previous conversations and referenced them weeks later, which made her feel seen in a way that was genuinely moving. And he drove 3 hours from Cincinnati to Lexington on a Thursday night to bring her dinner when she mentioned offhandedly that she had been working late and hadn't eaten properly all week. He was thoughtful in the specific, personal way that is far more compelling than grand gestures, the kind of thoughtfulness that communicates that someone has been paying close attention to exactly who you are. And for Claire, who had spent years pouring that exact kind of attention into other people's events, and other people's experiences, other people's needs, to receive it so clearly and so consistently was something she found, to her own surprise, almost overwhelming. She told a close friend during this period that she felt like she had finally been seen after years of being the one doing the seeing. Her friend told her later that when Claire said that, she had felt a complicated mixture of happiness for her and a quiet, unnamed unease she couldn't quite articulate at the time. She would be able to articulate it later. By then, of course, it would be too late to matter. They dated for 11 months before Raymond proposed. The proposal was at a rooftop restaurant in Cincinnati, with a view of the city at night, and it was beautiful and well orchestrated, and Claire said yes, and she meant it completely. She was 26 years old, and she was in love with a man who had, for nearly a year, shown up for her in ways that felt real and consistent and safe. She had no reason to doubt what she was saying yes to. She had every reason, by every available measure, to believe she was stepping into something good. The wedding was 8 months later, a medium-size affair, tasteful and warm, planned largely by Claire herself with the help of a colleague, because of course Claire planned her own wedding. She was meticulous about it. The flowers, the lighting, the seating, the menu, all of it considered and deliberate and personal. Her mother, Dorothy, she cried through the entire ceremony. Her father, Gerald, walked her down the aisle with his back absolutely straight and his chin up and his hand trembling slightly on her arm. It was, by all accounts, a beautiful day. Claire has one photograph from that day that she kept for a long time after everything that followed, a candid shot of her and her father right before she walked through the door, his hand on her cheek, both of them laughing at something no one else can see. She kept it because of his face in that moment, because of how proud he looked, because she knew, even then, that he would always be proud of her regardless of what came next, and she needed something to hold on to that felt like that. The Caldwell family was, on the surface, exactly what you would expect from a successful Cincinnati real estate family, with 3 decades of business history and a social reputation they tended carefully. There was Raymond's mother, Eleanor, a tall, precise woman in her late 60s who wore her hair in a silver chignon and carried herself with the specific posture of someone who has never once in her entire adult life walked into a room unsure of her standing in it. There were Raymond's 2 siblings, his brother, Douglas, and his sister, Patricia Ann, both of whom were married into the kind of social circles where your country club membership says more about you than your resume. There were in-laws, cousins, family friends, business associates who had been around so long they were treated as family. It was a large, dense, interconnected social world, and it had very clear rules about who belonged in it and who was being, at best, generously accommodated. Claire understood this before she married Raymond. She was perceptive enough to read the room at her first family gathering, a Sunday dinner at Eleanor's house in Hyde Park, and recognized that she was being assessed. She understood it, and she accepted it because she had every confidence in her own ability to demonstrate, over time, that she was worthy of genuine inclusion. That was the framework through which she approached the Caldwell family in the beginning, not with defensiveness or resentment, but with the same quiet determination she applied to everything else in her life. She would show them who she was through her character and her consistency, and eventually they would see it, and then everything would be fine. That confidence, genuine, well-founded in every other context of her life, was, in this particular situation, the thing that kept her in place just long enough for the trap to fully close. The first sign was small enough that Claire almost talked herself out of noticing it. It was at that first Sunday dinner at Eleanor's house, 3 weeks before the wedding, and it came in the form of a comment so precisely placed that it required a certain level of sophistication to recognize it for what it was. The family was at the table, conversation moving easily through the topics such families discuss: business, social events, travel, mutual acquaintances, and Claire made a comment about a project she was working on, and a large corporate retreat she was coordinating for a tech company's regional leadership team. It was a significant contract, one she was proud of, and she shared a detail or two about the logistical complexity involved. Eleanor looked at her, and it was the looking that was the tell, not the words, with an expression that was not quite dismissive but not quite engaged. Annan said, "How lovely that you have something to keep you busy." And then she turned to Douglas and asked him something about a property development in the northern suburbs. The table continued. Raymond didn't say anything. Claire picked up her fork. She filed it. She did not allow herself to react in the moment because she was a professional and she understood social dynamics, and she was, above all, a woman who did not make scenes. But she filed it. And over the months that followed, the file grew. It is important, when telling a story like this one, to resist the impulse to present the escalation as a clean, linear progression, because that is not how it works, and that is not how it felt from the inside. From the inside, it felt like weather, like days that were perfectly fine and warm and even genuinely good, interrupted by sudden, sharp, cold fronts that arrived without warning and were gone before you could fully process them. And a Sunday dinner where Eleanor made a comment about Claire's background, not aggressively, just casually, conversationally, in the way that people say things that reveal exactly what they think while maintaining total plausible deniability. A family gathering where Claire noticed that the women were organizing plans around her and she wasn't included, and when she mentioned it to Raymond on the drive home, he said she was being oversensitive. And a work achievement she shared with Raymond. She had landed a significant contract with a downtown hotel group, her largest independent client to date. And his response was a flat, uninterested, "That's good," followed immediately by a pivot to something he wanted to talk about. Small things, individually dismissible, collectively a pattern. And the pattern had a direction. Claire was someone who had spent her professional life reading rooms, reading people, anticipating needs before they were expressed. She knew what the pattern meant. She just wasn't ready yet to say it out loud, because saying it out loud meant admitting that the person she had chosen, the family she had married into, the life she had said yes to, meant admitting that she had been wrong about all of it. And Claire Mercer was not a woman who gave up easily. She was, if anything, too committed to trying. Raymond's control over her daily life did not arrive all at once. That is something she has said repeatedly in the years since, and it is something that is consistent with what we know from research and from the documented experiences of people who have been in controlling relationships. It arrives incrementally. Each individual shift is small enough to rationalize, to explain, to accommodate. He started making comments about what she wore. Not demands, not ultimatums, just the persistent, undermining commentary of someone who has decided that their aesthetic preferences are a legitimate claim on another person's choices. She would come downstairs dressed for a work event, and he would look at her outfit and say something like, "Is that really what you want to wear?" And the question would hang in the air with a weight that was entirely disproportionate to its surface meaning. She began choosing her clothes with him in mind before she left the bedroom. That is a small thing to lose. And it doesn't sound like much, but it was the first room in her life that he moved into without being invited, and once he was there, he did not leave. He began making comments about her friends, not forbidding her from seeing them, not yet, but expressing, consistently and creatively, his disapproval of them. Her closest friend from university, a woman named Jenna, was characterized by Raymond as someone who was a bad influence and not the right kind of people for where he and Claire were trying to go socially. He said it with such smooth confidence, such apparent reasonableness, that Claire found herself defending Jenna less and less, and seeing her less and less, until one day she realized that months had passed without the two of them being in the same room. He controlled the money within the first year of their marriage. Not dramatically, but structurally. He consolidated their accounts, positioned himself as the one who managed the finances, and instituted what he called a household budget that required Claire to account for her personal spending in a way that he never did for his own. He called it practicality. He called it financial discipline. Claire, who had managed her own finances carefully and independently since the age of 17, found herself asking her own husband for money to buy a birthday gift for her mother. Eleanor Caldwell was not a passive observer of what was happening to her daughter-in-law. This is something that needs to be said clearly. Eleanor was not someone who simply tolerated the situation or remained willfully blind to it. Eleanor was, in ways both subtle and not so subtle, an active participant in a family culture that validated Raymond's behavior and consistently communicated to Claire that her place in this family was conditional, marginal, and beneath what Raymond deserved. She made this clear in the particular language of women of her social background, not through raised voices or overt confrontation, but through the steady, refined application of small exclusions and precise cruelties that left no fingerprints. There was the Christmas dinner where Eleanor announced a family vacation that had been planned and booked, 2 weeks in the Cayman Islands, the full Caldwell family, and Claire was learning about it at the table along with everyone else, and the only one who had not been consulted or informed in advance. When she mentioned this to Raymond later, quietly, without accusation, he told her that she was being dramatic. There was the afternoon Eleanor came to their home and walked through Claire's kitchen making comments about the organization of the cabinets. Not asking, not suggesting, but telling, in the tone of a woman correcting something that was hers to correct. And there was the way Eleanor referred to Claire in conversations with family friends, as Raymond's wife when she was present, which was fine, but as the girl Raymond married when she thought Claire was not within earshot, which was not. Claire heard it once. She didn't tell Raymond. She knew, by that point, what telling Raymond would produce. Raymond, when confronted with anything that required him to choose between his mother and his wife, chose his mother. Every single time. And without hesitation. Often with an explanation of why Claire had misunderstood or overreacted. This was not a difficult pattern to identify. It simply became a pattern Claire learned to live around, the way you learn to navigate furniture in a dark room. Carefully, with your hands out, not because the furniture is going to move, but because you still have to live in the house. The abuse, and I want to use that word clearly and without qualification, because that is what it was, evolved over the course of approximately 2 years from emotional and psychological control into something that occasionally crossed into physical territory. Claire has spoken about this carefully and with the measured language of someone who has processed it extensively and chooses her words with great precision. She does not describe a pattern of constant physical violence. She describes specific incidents, a handful of them, severe enough, real enough, but each one followed by the particular aftermath that people who have experienced this know very well. The apology that sounds like remorse, the period of relative calm that feels like recovery, the slow return of tension that signals what is coming again. She describes a night in the second year of their marriage where an argument escalated in the kitchen. An argument that had started over something ordinary and meaningless. In the way these things always do. And Raymond grabbed her by the arm with enough force to leave a mark and pushed her back against the counter and said things to her in a voice she had never heard from him before. She slid down the cabinet to the floor. She stayed there for a long time after he had walked out of the kitchen. She sat on the floor of her own home, and she looked at the arm where his hand had been, and she thought, not about leaving. Not yet. And not in that moment. She thought about how quiet the house was. She thought about how far away she was from Harlan. She thought about her mother and her father, and she thought about the person she had been at 24, with her notebooks full of plans, and she thought, who is that person now? Where did she go? And then, in the particular way that the mind protects itself, something shifted. Something small. Something that would take months to grow into action. But that began. Right there on that kitchen floor, as a single, quiet, defiant thought. She thought, I used to know exactly who I was, and I want her back. That thought, she has said, was the beginning of the end of that chapter of her life. Not the leaving. The leaving would come later, and it would take planning and courage and the kind of patience that is actually its own form of strength. But the thought, the refusal, even in that moment, to fully surrender the memory of herself, that was the turn. And that was the thing that Raymond, for all his control and all his precision, could not reach. He could control the money and the clothes and the social calendar and the narrative within his family. He could make her question her perceptions and apologize for her reactions and shrink her world down to the dimensions he preferred. But he could not get inside the part of her that remembered who she had been before him. And that part, stubborn and quiet and patient, was already making plans. She spent the next several months in a state of careful, deliberate preparation that required her to sustain every single day the performance of normalcy while executing a private plan with the methodical precision of someone who knows that one mistake could cost them everything. She researched. She had always been a researcher, always been someone who gathered information thoroughly before making a move, and she applied that skill now to the most important project of her life. Though she found resources through online searches conducted on her lunch break at work, using her work computer, because she knew Raymond occasionally checked her phone. She learned about financial abuse and the specific steps involved in rebuilding financial independence after a controlled marriage. She began setting aside small amounts of cash from her work income, not enough to be noticed in any single instance, but accumulating carefully over weeks into something that could matter. She reconnected quietly with Jenna, her university friend, who had never stopped reaching out even during the long silence, and who answered the phone when Claire called without asking any questions she didn't need to ask, and simply said, "Whatever you need, I'm here." Claire told Jenna the shape of the plan. Not everything. She was careful about everything. But enough. She gathered copies of essential documents, her passport, her social security card, her college transcripts, and her professional certifications, her original birth certificate. She put them in a manila envelope and gave the envelope to Jenna to hold. She packed a single duffel bag, small and unassuming, the kind of bag that could plausibly be a gym bag, and put it at the very back of the closet behind a winter coat. Inside the bag, 3 days of clothes, the cash she had saved, a notebook with phone numbers, her professional portfolio on a USB drive, and one photograph. The photograph was of herself at 22, laughing at something at a university event, her head thrown back, completely unguarded, completely herself. She put it in the bag because she needed to remember who she was running back to. On a Tuesday morning in March, while Raymond was at a breakfast meeting with his family's accountant, a meeting she had confirmed the night before by glancing at his calendar on the kitchen counter, Claire Mercer got dressed and picked up her duffel bag from the back of the closet and walked through her house one final time. She has described this walk in interviews, and I find it one of the most quietly arresting details of the entire story. She didn't rush. She moved through each room slowly and deliberately, not with nostalgia. She was very clear about this, but with something more like conclusion, like someone finishing a chapter and being certain of that fact before turning the page. And she stood in the kitchen for a moment. She looked at the floor beside the cabinet under the sink, and then she looked up and she walked to the front door and she opened it and she stepped outside and she closed it behind her without looking back. She had called a cab the night before, from a payphone at a gas station near her office, and it was waiting around the corner. She got in. She gave the driver the address of a bus station. She did not look back at the house as the cab pulled away. Oh, she had promised herself she wouldn't, and she was a woman who kept her promises to herself. Raymond came home that evening to an empty house. On the kitchen counter, there was a single handwritten note. It was not a long note. She had thought carefully about what to say and had decided that most of what she could say was unnecessary. The last line of the note read, "Don't look for me. You won't find who you're expecting." Raymond's response to Claire's departure was, thus as she would later learn from mutual acquaintances and from the scattered reporting that touched on their situation through civil proceedings, almost entirely about his own sense of having been defied. There was very little, by any account, that resembled grief. There was anger. There was the bruised entitlement of a man who had organized his entire understanding of his marriage around control, and who now found that the object of that control had simply removed itself from his reach. And he called her cell phone repeatedly, and when she did not answer, she had gotten a new number before she left the bus station, he began calling Jenna, and when Jenna did not answer, he called Claire's parents. Dorothy took the call. She listened to Raymond describe his concern for Claire's well-being, and then Dorothy, who had grown up in Harlan, Kentucky, and had a particular gift for saying a great deal in very few words, told Raymond that if Claire had left, she had her reasons, and that this family's concern would be directed at their daughter's healing, not at making Raymond's life more convenient. She hung up. Raymond filed a missing persons report with the local police department. The detective who handled it after a brief investigation concluded what was true, that Claire Mercer was a competent adult who had chosen to leave her marriage voluntarily, and closed the report. Eleanor Caldwell, upon learning that her daughter-in-law had left, is reported to have said to Raymond within hours, "Well, this is probably for the best." She then moved on to discussing a property deal Douglas was navigating. Raymond's family processed Claire's departure as a relief and a confirmation of what they had always believed, that she had not been right for him, that the marriage had been a mistake, and that Raymond would now be free to find someone more appropriate. They were, and in the language of people who believe the world arranges itself for their comfort, ready to move on. What they did not know, what none of them had any way of knowing, was that the woman they were so efficiently erasing from the family narrative was, at that exact moment, sitting on a Greyhound bus headed to Atlanta, Georgia, with $840 in cash, a duffel bag, a USB drive with her professional portfolio, and a plan. She arrived in Atlanta on a Wednesday morning and checked into an extended-stay motel on the outskirts of Midtown that charged by the week and asked no unnecessary questions. She spent the first 3 days doing almost nothing except sleeping, a kind of sleep she described later as the first real sleep she had had in years, the sleep of a person whose body has finally registered that the threat has passed. On the 4th day, she got up early, made herself coffee in the small motel kitchenette, opened her notebook, and began. She had a plan. It was not yet a detailed plan. It was a framework, a sequence of priorities arranged in the order in which they needed to be addressed. First, stable housing. Second, income. Third, legal separation. Fourth, rebuilding. She worked through the list with the same systematic clarity she had always applied to event logistics. She found a small, affordable apartment through a Craigslist listing, a studio in a building in East Atlanta with a landlord who required first month, last month, and a security deposit, all of which she had just enough to cover. She moved in within 2 weeks of arriving in the city. The apartment was small enough that she could touch both walls of the main room if she stood in the center and stretched her arms. She didn't care. It was hers. Her name on the lease, her key, and her decisions about every detail within it. She bought a plant from a hardware store for $3 and put it on the windowsill and felt, in that completely disproportionate way, like she had reclaimed something important. She got a job within the first week, a catering coordination role at a mid-size hotel near the convention center, the kind of position she was significantly overqualified for, but that gave her income and, more importantly, immediate access to Atlanta's event industry network. She introduced herself to everyone she met. She asked good questions and remembered the answers. She showed up early and stayed late and solved problems before they were asked to be solved. Within 6 months, she had been promoted. Within 8 months, she had 2 freelance corporate event clients she was managing independently on the side. Within 14 months, she had registered a business, Mercer Events Group, LLC. And she had a business checking account with her name on it, and 6 months of operating expenses saved, and a client list that was growing faster than she had dared to project. She had, against every odd that the previous several years had assembled against her, begun. The Atlanta event industry in the years during which Claire was building Mercer Events Group was a genuinely competitive and demanding market. And the fact that she not only survived in it but began to distinguish herself within a relatively short period of time is a testament to something that Raymond and his family had never been able to take from her. She was extraordinarily good at what she did. She had a specific skill set that is rarer than it sounds, the ability to hold an enormous number of logistical variables simultaneously in her mind, while maintaining the warmth and human attentiveness that made clients feel cared for rather than processed. She could design an event experience with genuine creative vision and then execute it with the precision of an engineer. She understood budget management, vendor negotiation, client psychology, staff coordination, and the particular art of making something that has been months in the planning appear effortless to the 1,200 people experiencing it for the first time. These skills were not new. She had had them at 24. What was new was that she was now building something with them for herself, on her own terms, without anyone's permission or approval or commentary. A Mercer Events Group became known in Atlanta's philanthropic and corporate community first through word of mouth, the most reliable and durable kind of marketing, and then through the kind of editorial mentions that arrive when your work is genuinely exceptional. A foundation director told another foundation director. A corporate client referred her to their sister company. A charity gala she produced in her second year of business was mentioned in a regional lifestyle publication as one of the most beautifully executed events the city had seen in a decade. Her phone stopped being quiet. She hired her first employee, a young woman named Brianna, fresh out of Georgia State's hospitality program, who turned out to be an extraordinary coordinator and who is still with the company today. And she moved Mercer Events Group out of the spare bedroom of her apartment and into a small but real office space in a building near Ponce City Market. She put her name on the door. She took a photograph of the name on the door and sent it to her mother, Dorothy, with no caption. Dorothy replied with a single word. Baby. She met Thomas around the beginning of her 3rd year in Atlanta. We at an industry awards dinner where Mercer Events Group had been nominated for, and won, an Emerging Company Award in the Southeast events sector. Thomas Whitfield was not in the events industry. He was a structural engineer who had been brought to the dinner as a guest of a colleague who was receiving an award in a different category. He was sitting at a table near the back of the room, which is where he preferred to be at events he had not planned to attend, and Claire found him there after the program when she was circling the room and thanking people for the nomination. They talked for 45 minutes. She told me, when I spoke with her, that what she noticed first was that he asked her a question she had not been asked in a very long time. What's the best part of your work? Not, what do you do? Which is the question people ask when they are waiting for their turn to talk. But what's the best part? It was such a specific, a genuine question that she found herself, to her own surprise, actually thinking about the answer before she gave it. She told him, the moment right before the doors open, when everything is set and the room is ready, and you know that in a few seconds people are going to walk in and experience something you built for them. He nodded slowly, and she could tell he was actually processing what she had said. And then he said, that's similar to what I feel right before a building is signed off, when the math becomes real. They exchanged cards. He called 2 days later. He did not play games about timing. He did not manage his availability to seem less interested than he was. He called when he said he would, he showed up when he said he would, and he treated her, from the very beginning, consistently and without exception, as someone whose time and intelligence and opinion and comfort all genuinely mattered to him. She was careful. She was, it is fair to say, almost scientifically careful in how she allowed this relationship to develop, because she was a person who now had very detailed and very hard-won knowledge of what it feels like to have been wrong about someone. She took her time. Thomas was patient with her timing, without ever making her feel that patience was a sacrifice. A year after they met, he told her he was in love with her. She told him she loved him too, and that she was also a little terrified, and he said, that makes sense, and I'm not going anywhere. They were married the following spring in a small ceremony in the backyard of a friend's home in Decatur. 28 people, the food made by a chef they both loved, wildflowers everywhere. No formal program, just the two of them standing in afternoon light saying exactly what they meant to each other. Dorothy was in the front row in a blue dress. Gerald walked Claire out the back door and gave her to the man who had, in his quiet and steady way, helped her remember what she deserved. Gerald shook Thomas's hand for a long time before he let go. The contract for the Harrington Foundation Gala came to Mercer Events Group in the early fall. 5 years after Claire had arrived in Atlanta with $840 and a duffel bag. The Harrington Foundation was one of the most prominent philanthropic organizations in the Southeast, with a legacy of support for educational access initiatives and a donor base that extended across multiple states and into the national corporate landscape. Their annual gala was the most significant fundraising event on their calendar, and they had, for the previous 2 years, been looking for a production partner who could take the event to a higher level, someone who combined creative vision with flawless execution, and who understood how to create the kind of experience that moved major donors emotionally, as well as impressing them logistically. A board member who had attended one of Mercer Events Group's previous productions made the recommendation. The Foundation's Director of Development reached out to Claire directly. The scope of the project was unlike anything Mercer Events Group had handled before. 1,200 guests, a budget approaching $500,000, a historic venue in downtown Atlanta, national media credibility, and the weight of an organization's reputation attached to every single decision. Claire sat with the proposal for 2 days before she said yes. Not because she doubted her capability, but because she understood the scale of what she was agreeing to, and she wanted to say yes from a place of full clarity rather than excitement. She said yes on a Thursday afternoon in her office, with Brianna and 2 other team members present, and then she looked at her team and said, "All right, let's build something extraordinary." She called Thomas that evening and told him. He said, "I already knew you were going to say yes." She asked him how he knew, and he said, "Because this is exactly what you built Mercer Events Group to do." The planning process took 8 months. Claire managed it with the systematic thoroughness that had become the hallmark of her company. Vendor selection, venue logistics, catering design, lighting and audio production, program flow, seating architecture, communication with the Foundation's team at every stage. She was on site at the venue dozens of times before the event. She knew every corner of that building, In every logistical pressure point, every moment in the evening sequence where something could go sideways, and what the contingency was if it did. The flowers were imported from 3 different countries, Ecuador, Thailand, the Netherlands, because Claire had a specific vision for the floral design and she was not willing to compromise it. Thomas, who attended several of the production meetings in the final weeks, I watched his wife orchestrate a team of 40 people with a combination of warmth and precision that he found genuinely astonishing, and told her so. Claire told him that she had been doing this her whole life. Thomas said, "I know. That's what I mean." The guest list for the Harrington Foundation Gala ran to several hundred names, reflecting the breadth of the foundation's donor and community relationships. And Claire reviewed it in sections as the RSVPs came in. Not because she knew most of the names, but because knowing who was attending was part of doing the job well. She was reviewing one of the final sections on a Tuesday afternoon, 11 days before the event, when her eyes stopped. She sat with what she was looking at for a moment. Then she took the guest list page and walked down the hall to Thomas's home office, where he was working. Then she set it on the desk in front of him without a word and pointed to 2 names. He looked at the list. He looked at her. He said, "Do you want to have them removed?" She looked at her husband for a moment, and then she said, "Absolutely not." She went back to her office and she closed the door, and she sat quietly for a while. She thought about what it meant that this was happening, that the world, in its particular indifference to human drama, had arranged for Raymond Caldwell and his mother to be guests at an event that Claire Mercer had built. She thought about all the dinners at Eleanor's table. She thought about the missing persons report. She thought about the note she had left on the kitchen counter. She thought about the bus and the motel and the $3 plant on the windowsill. She thought about Dorothy in the blue dress. She thought about Thomas saying, "I'm not going anywhere." And she decided, not with drama, but not with a plan for confrontation, not with any architecture of revenge. She decided that she was going to do exactly what she had always done. She was going to build the most extraordinary event she had ever produced. She was going to show up fully and completely. She was going to be exactly who she was, in a room she had created, on a night she had made possible, with a company she had built from $840 and a USB drive and a refusal to disappear. And if Raymond Caldwell and Eleanor Caldwell walked through the doors of that room, they would walk through her doors, into her room. And there was absolutely nothing they could do about any of it. The night of the Harrington Foundation Gala was everything that 8 months of meticulous planning and 5 years of professional discipline could produce. The venue was transformed in a way that made experienced donors and longtime foundation supporters stop in the entrance and simply stand still for a moment, taking it in. The lighting moved through warm gold and soft ivory in a way that made every face in the room look like it was being lit for a film. The floral design was genuinely breathtaking, dense, layered, specific, unlike anything the Atlanta philanthropic circuit had seen at an event of this kind. Why, the program was paced with the rhythm of someone who understood that 1,200 people had given their evening to this foundation and deserved to be moved, not just impressed. The catering was thoughtful and generous. The auction raised more money than any previous Harrington Gala in the organization's history. Before the formal program began, before the foundation's executive director took the stage, Claire stood at the top of the grand staircase in a gold gown and looked out at 1,200 people in her room, and she felt something that she has said she will spend the rest of her life being grateful for. She felt like herself, completely, freely, finally, and entirely herself. Thomas stood beside her. His hand was at the small of her back, easy and natural, the way people touch each other when they are genuinely at home with one another. And across the ballroom floor, Raymond Caldwell, in a tailored suit, accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server and looked around the room with the slow, approving scan of a man who had no idea whose room he was standing in. He had been there for approximately 40 minutes. He had spoken with several people he recognized from Cincinnati's business community who were there as national donors. He had complimented the venue to his mother, standing beside him. He was comfortable. He was at ease. He had absolutely no idea. The formal program began at 7:45. The foundation's executive director welcomed the guests, spoke briefly about the organization's work and impact, and then said what she always said at this point in the evening, that none of it would be possible without the people who made it happen, starting with the team that had produced this extraordinary event. She said the name. She said Mercer Events Group. And she said, "Please welcome our hosts for the evening, Thomas and Claire Whitfield." And Claire walked to the stage. She walked across the room with Thomas and up the stairs to the podium, and she thanked her team by name. She thanked the foundation. She welcomed the guests. She told them what the evening was for, and she did it all with the composure and warmth and competence of a woman who was exactly where she was supposed to be. And somewhere in the middle of this, at the specific moment that the room heard her name, at the moment the light caught the gold gown and the crowd applauded and 1,200 people turned their attention to the woman at the podium, Raymond Caldwell turned to look at the stage. He saw Thomas first. Then his eyes moved to the woman beside Thomas. And then 4 seconds passed. 4 seconds during which his brain processed what his eyes were showing him. The posture, the voice, the composure, and the gold gown, the name, and during which the color went out of his face in a way that people standing nearby would later describe as remarkable. His mother, Eleanor, noticed. She looked at her son. She looked at the stage. She understood. And for perhaps the first time in her long life of saying exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment, Eleanor Caldwell had absolutely nothing to say. Claire did not look at Raymond during her remarks. She had decided, at some point in the 11 days between seeing his name on the guest list and this moment, that she would not perform for him in any direction. She would not avoid him pointedly. She would not acknowledge him pointedly. She would simply be who she was, in her room, doing her work, and she would allow the facts of the situation to carry whatever meaning they carried without any editorial assistance from her. She finished her welcome, thanked the guests again, and stepped off the stage, and was immediately surrounded by foundation board members and major donors and colleagues and friends, all of whom had things to say about the room she had built and the evening she had created. She moved through the crowd and she laughed and she listened and she was present, and for the next hour she did not seek out Raymond and did not avoid him and thought about him approximately as much as the evening required, which was not very much at all. Raymond, in that hour, I went through several iterations of what a man in his position goes through when he is confronted with an undeniable rearrangement of everything he thought he understood. He had told this woman she was nothing. He had endorsed a family culture that treated her as a marginal convenience. He had watched her slide down a kitchen cabinet to the floor and walked out of the room. He had filed a missing persons report because she had dared to leave without his permission. And she had built this. She had built this room, this night, this company, this life. And she had built it entirely without him, entirely after him, entirely because she had refused, even on the kitchen floor, to surrender the memory of who she was. He approached her at 8:47. She was speaking with a foundation director near one of the main floral installations when she sensed movement to her left and turned to see Raymond standing a few feet away. And he was waiting, in the particular way of someone who needs to speak to you, but cannot make himself simply begin. Thomas, who had been standing a few feet away in a separate conversation, registered something in Claire's posture and moved to her side, without it needing to be a gesture. His hand went to the small of her back. The foundation director, who is a perceptive person, read the room with the speed of someone who has spent decades navigating complex social dynamics and excused herself naturally. And then it was the three of them, Raymond, Claire, and Thomas. Raymond said, "Diane." He used a version of her name, the name he had always called her, a shortening that had been his preference, not hers. She registered this and she let it pass. She said, "Raymond, I didn't expect to see you here." Polite, entirely composed. The voice of a woman who is, in every measurable way, at home. He looked around the room, slowly, taking in the flowers and the lighting and the 1,200 people and the stage where her name had been said to sustained applause. And he said, "You did all of this?" Not a compliment. A reckoning. The question of a man doing arithmetic he didn't want to do. She said, "Yes, we did." She gestured to Thomas. She introduced them. The handshake between Thomas and Raymond lasted the appropriate amount of time and communicated. On Thomas's part, nothing more and nothing less than polite acknowledgement of someone his wife happened to know. And then Raymond said what small men say when they are cornered by the size of their own mistakes. He said, "I just want you to know. I'm glad you're doing well." And Claire Mercer Whitfield, who had been on the floor of a kitchen this man had walked out of, who had built herself back from $840 and a $3 plant, or who was standing in a room she had built that contained 1,200 people who had paid to be there, looked at Raymond Caldwell and said, "Thank you, Raymond. Enjoy your evening." And she turned back to the room, to her event, to her life. She did not look back. Eleanor came to her later, near the end of the evening. When the crowd had thinned and the formal program was complete and Mercer Events Group's team was beginning the quiet logistical processes that marked the end of a major production. She came alone, without Raymond, and she stood in front of Claire with an expression that was, and this is the word Claire uses, and I find it precise, an expression that was reduced. Not small, because Eleanor Caldwell had not spent 68 years becoming a woman who was easily made small, but reduced. And like something had been taken out of her that she had been carrying without knowing she was carrying it. She looked at Claire for a moment and she said, "I didn't know you had all of this in you." And after a pause, she said, "I think I misjudged you." Claire has said, and I believe her, that a dozen responses were available to her in that moment, some of them justifiable, some of them earned, all of them understandable. She chose none of them. She looked at Eleanor Caldwell, who had told her son at a Christmas dinner that marrying Claire had been a mistake, and she said, "I know you did. I hope Raymond's well." And she walked back to her team. She found Thomas by the bar, talking with a foundation board member, and he turned when she arrived and pulled her gently into the conversation with a hand at her elbow, and she stood there and laughed at something the board member said, and the rest of the evening was hers completely. 3 days after the gala, a message came through the contact form on the Mercer Events Group website. It was long, several paragraphs. Formal in structure in the way that people are formal when they are attempting to control the terms of their own vulnerability. Claire read it in her office with the door closed. The message said, in the particular language of a man who has spent a great deal of time with lawyers, that Raymond had been thinking since the evening of the gala. That seeing her, seeing what she had created, seeing who she had become, had caused him to reflect. That he was sorry, though the word arrived surrounded by so much qualification and self-explanation that its sincerity was difficult to isolate. That he knew he had no right to any response or any consideration, and that he wanted her to know, and this is the part that Claire read twice and then set the laptop aside for a while, that he regretted letting her go, as though she had been a migratory bird that he had chosen, out of the goodness of his heart, to release. As though the $840 and the emergency bag and the 6 weeks of terrified, methodical planning had been his decision rather than her survival. She showed it to Thomas that evening. Thomas read it and was quiet for a moment and then said, "Whatever you decide to do is right. There's nothing you owe him." And then he said, "But I don't think his regret should be yours to carry. That's his work." She left the message unanswered. She thought about it over the following days, not with grief or anger or the complicated longing that people sometimes feel for even painful chapters of their lives, but with the kind of clear, settled certainty that comes from having done the harder thing already and knowing exactly who you are now on the other side of it. And then, one morning a few weeks later, she opened her inbox, found the message, and deleted it. She told me, "I didn't delete it because I was angry at him. And I deleted it because I realized his regret is his story. My healing is mine. I'm done mixing those two things up." I've been thinking about what Claire's story says about all of us. Not just about abuse or resilience or the particular architecture of what it takes to leave and rebuild, but about something broader. We live in a culture that loves a specific kind of comeback story, the one with a dramatic confrontation, and the one where the villain is publicly humiliated and the protagonist delivers a speech and the injustice is made visible to everyone who needs to see it. And I understand why we love that story. There is something deeply human about wanting the record corrected loudly, about wanting people who did damage to be seen doing damage. But Claire's story is not that story. And I think that might be why it is, in some important way, more powerful. Claire did not set a trap, but she did not engineer a moment. She did not plan for Raymond to be in that room. She simply refused to remove him from a guest list he had every legitimate right to be on, because removing him would have been about him, and she was done being about him. The gala was not a weapon. It was just Tuesday for Claire. And the fact that Raymond walked into it, the fact that the world arranged itself in this particular configuration on this particular night, was not her doing. It was simply the inevitable consequence of two trajectories, one that kept moving and one that didn't. Raymond and his family had spent years after Claire's departure largely not thinking about her, or thinking about her only in the dismissive, self-serving way people think about the people they have wronged when there are no consequences to prompt anything deeper. Claire had spent those same years building something. And when those two trajectories converged in a ballroom in Atlanta, and only one of them had anything to show for the time that had passed. The thing I come back to every time I sit with this story is a question about what abuse actually does, what it is actually trying to do, at its core. And I think the answer, stripped of every specific circumstance and personality and context, is this. It tries to replace you. It tries to substitute someone else's version of you for your own. It works by being persistent and loud and proximate, by being the most consistent voice in your immediate environment until, through sheer repetition, it starts to sound like the truth. Raymond's version of Claire was small and replaceable and unworthy and lucky to be included. Eleanor's version of Claire was inadequate and beneath them and correctly dismissed. And for a period of time, a real period of time, during which she sat on kitchen floors and packed emergency bags and talked herself into staying just a little longer, that version had tremendous power. Not because it was true, but because she was exhausted and isolated, and the people saying it had positioned themselves as the authority on who she was. What Claire did, slowly, quietly, over years, was simply insist on her own version, not dramatically, not as a performance, and just as a daily practice of continuing to be who she was, even when every structural pressure around her was trying to persuade her she was someone smaller. She held on to the memory of herself on the bus. She held on to it in the motel. She held on to it when she got the $3 plant. She held on to it when she registered the LLC and put her name on the office door and photographed it and sent it to Dorothy with no caption. And eventually, through the daily, unglamorous, absolutely uncinematic accumulation of showing up for herself, the version Raymond had tried to install simply ran out of room. And the original version, the one that had always been there, moved back in and filled the space completely. That is what walked into that ballroom in a gold dress. That is what stood at the podium and said her name to 1,200 people. That is what looked at Raymond Caldwell across a room she had built and felt, by every account. I'd essentially nothing. Not triumph, not bitterness, not grief. Just the quiet, complete freedom of someone who is entirely, finally, home in themselves. Before I let you go tonight, I need to ask you something. And I want you to actually sit with it rather than just answer it quickly. What was the moment in this story that hit you the hardest? Was it the kitchen floor? Was it the duffel bag and the $3 plant? Was it the 4 seconds on Raymond's face? Was it Eleanor saying, "I misjudged you," and Claire walking away? Was it Thomas saying, "I'm not going anywhere"? I genuinely want to know. Tell me in the comments below, because our community has conversations in those comments that I find remarkable, and I read them, more of them than you probably think. And I want to ask you something harder than that. For anyone watching tonight who recognized something of your own story in Claire's, whether it is the slow erosion, and the voice that started telling you who you were, the emergency bag at the back of the closet that exists only in the form of a thought you haven't let yourself finish yet, I want you to know that the second half of the story exists for you too. The ballroom exists. Whatever your version of it is real, and it is available, and the path to it begins the same way Claire's did, with one quiet, stubborn, defiant thought about who you used to be. That thought is enough to start. It was enough for her. And the story I'm bringing you next, I need to tell you, because if you made it this far in this video, you and I are in this together, and you deserve to know what's coming. The next story involves a woman who discovered after 30 years of marriage that the man she had built her life with had been living an entirely parallel existence in a different city, under a different name, with a family who had never heard her name. And the detail that emerged during the court proceedings, the single piece of evidence that no one on either side had anticipated, changed everything anyone thought they understood about who he was. The truth had been visible for 30 years. No one had known to look. Subscribe right now so you do not miss it. Hit the bell so it finds you. And if this story moved you, if it made you think of someone you know, or something you have been carrying, or a version of yourself you have been trying to find your way back to, share it with them tonight. You might not know exactly why you're thinking of them. I would trust that instinct. She didn't plot her triumph. She just refused to disappear. And the rest wrote itself.